Thanks, Reverend Amy. Some of you may not know much about the Jewish Theological Seminary down the street, so let me say that, as the name suggests, we do prepare rabbis. We also prepare cantors who lead the musical traditions inside our synagogues throughout North America. We prepare Jewish educators for a variety of educational settings from little kids to adults. We have an undergraduate college where about 200 students study simultaneously either at Columbia or Barnard and also at JTS. And we have a graduate school which prepares PhDs and MAs in Jewish studies. We have one of the two greatest Judaica libraries in the world, which you should know as a member of the public of this neighborhood is open to you, which means we have a collection of something like 40,000 books and manuscripts, some of them about 1,000 years old. And aside from all of that, JTS has a mission of giving a vision to Jews around the world, but particularly in the United States, of what Jewish life can be. What I mean by that vision is, for instance, we have always emphasized the arts. The arts as an important part of culture. As you probably know, in the 19th century, this notion of Geist, or spirit, included both religion and the arts, and JTS is the founding sponsor and still the sponsor of the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue, which is the greatest Jewish museum in North America. And another instance of this notion of vision is that from the very beginning, we have stressed cooperation with other faiths and other faith communities. So in 1938, as the war clouds gathered and as the Nazis were ascendant in Europe, the Chancellor of JTS, Louis Finkelstein, began something called the Institute for Religious and Social Studies, which regularly brought leaders of all different religious groups in New York City and the nation together at JTS. You probably have heard of my personal hero, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who in the mid-60s gave a landmark address at Union Theological Seminary called No Religion is an Island. Heschel, as you may know, was best friends with Reinhold Niebuhr, which I'm proud to say is one of the times in history when the leading Christian theologian of the day and the leading Jewish theologian of the day were not simply conversation partners, but really close friends who regularly took walks up and down Riverside Drive together. Heschel was also, as you probably know, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. We have an iconic photo that hangs outside my office with Heschel marching beside Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama. And we lost Reverend Daniel Berrigan this week. Heschel and the Berrigan brothers were leaders of an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. He was probably the best known Jewish leader in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I'm hoping that JTS and UTS and Riverside and other institutions in this neighborhood are going to do a better job of working together in the years to come, building on that legacy, because like many of you, I believe that the point of this exercise is not just to remember the great things that happened 50 years ago, but to build on them and make sure that even greater things happen in our day. And that's why it's such an honor for me to be here today and such a personal pleasure. You know that we Jews just finished celebrating Passover. And you know that the point of the Passover Seder is to remember the redemption that happened in Egypt long ago. Of course, there are many opinions about what the purpose of that ceremony is. Mine, following a long tradition that goes back all the way to the beginning of the Passover Seder, is that we remember the redemption that happened in Egypt a long time ago so that we gather strength and inspiration and hope for joining in the work of redemption that has to happen right here, right now. It's not an exercise in recalling the past, it's an exercise in calling us to do the work that makes sure that that work of redemption continues. So the very first paragraph of the Passover Seder, you hold up the matzah. You say, this is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in Egypt long ago, and you make a kind of promise, a resolve, that with God's help, present-day individuals are not going to suffer the affliction that the ancestors suffered. There are people that are hungry. Let them come and eat. There are people that are needy. Let them have their needs satisfied. It says, this year, slaves. Next year, free. The point being that if you get to be free this year, it's your job to make sure that slavery is eradicated to the best of your ability in the year to come. And the point of doing that is not just for next year in Jerusalem, as we say, but for this year, right here, right now. Thank you. If I were preaching in synagogue, as I did yesterday in Park Avenue Synagogue on the east side, I would take off from the portion of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses, that Jews read in synagogue this week. It happens that the portion we read last week was called Acharei Mot, after the death, referring to the episode where Aaron has to witness the death of his 2 sons, learning to be priests when something goes wrong in their inauguration ceremony in the tabernacle, and the high priest Aaron loses his sons. By coincidence or not, Jews read the portion called After the Death in the same week that we observed Holocaust Remembrance Day, the greatest death, collective death of Jewish people, and one of the greatest collective acts of death and murder the world has ever seen. And the question then is, what do you do in the face of that? What do you do, as the Torah portion says, Acharei Mot, after the death? It happens that this week's Torah portion, which I'm going to talk about here today, is called Kedoshim, from the first words of Leviticus chapter 19, Kedoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy. So what is it that we do, whether in the face of personal suffering and personal loss, or in the face of incredible suffering in our world right now, the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, 1 billion people living on not more than $1 a day, and something like 2 billion people living on not more than $2 a day. What do you do in the face of that? You do your best, Kedoshim Tiyu, to be holy. And as you know from Leviticus, holiness is for us not primarily something you do in spaces like this, in acts of worship, although that is certainly part of it. But if you read through Leviticus, you see that primarily what it's about is not about prayer or worship or ritual. It's about day-to-day acts of justice and kindness in the world. Holiness is what you do with your kids and your parents and your spouses and your friends. It's a very good lesson for Mother's Day. Holy is what you do in the marketplace, making sure you have just weights and just measures and you're not cheating people. So holiness is not a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and we admire Mother Teresa, but holiness is primarily not about saintliness. When Leviticus utters this commandment, which we all know very well, which is at the very center of your faith as it is of mine, in chapter 19, verse 18, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus has already made it clear that love is not so much something that happens in here, love is something that happens out here. Love may start in a feeling, a commitment within the self, but love is lived between people, among people, in communities. So as far as I know, those 2 Hebrew words, Kedoshim Tiyu, those summon up the imperative which all of us have today. And I want to say one more thing in this connection about Leviticus before I move on to talk about how we can do this together. The refrain in this chapter is, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. There are some people, including many Jewish commentators, I confess, who interpret that line as a kind of a threat. You had better be holy, because I'm God, and I'm telling you to be holy, and if you're not holy, you're going to be punished. I stand with the 2,000 years and more of interpreters who regard that much more as invitation and reassurance and possibility. This is God saying to us, no matter how many times you failed in your life, no matter how much personal tragedy you have just suffered, no matter what death it is, Acharei Mot, that you are facing, You may not think you have the strength in you to stand up and make the world better, to cope with what you're coping with, but you do, because you are holy, and I, the Lord your God, am holy, and I made you, and you have my image in me, in you. Sorry, you have my image in you. And we have that message collectively. Right now, I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm feeling, not going to give a political address here, but let me just say that I'm afraid for the future of my country more than I ever have been in the last 50 years. And we're all wondering what's going on, and do we really have it in us to stand up and take care of what needs taken care of and not tear people down and tear them apart, but actually bring them together. And this is an assurance, in the words of Leviticus, you can do this. You may think you can't, but you can. You can do holy. And I love the fact that it's really a verb here, kedoshim tiyu. It doesn't talk about being holy, it talks about doing holy, right? Doing it. And you can do this because I, the Lord your God, am holy, and just as I am just, you can do justice, and just as I am holy, you can do acts of holiness. So you have this assurance, and sometimes, especially now, when we all seem engulfed by a kind of a hopelessness, like it's going to run by and we can't do anything to stop it, this verse comes as really precious reassurance that gives us hope when most we need it. Now, I want to talk about, for a few minutes now, about why I think this addresses all of us. I called my talk today, Doing Holiness Together, and let me talk a little bit about the together piece. Heschel, in that address at Union Theological Seminary in 1965, made the case, which I would venture to say the great majority of his fellow rabbis and huge numbers of Christian clergy would not have made. He made the case in very simple terms. He said, I'm quoting, Jews and Christians need one another to face up to the challenge and the expectation of the living God. This is one of the most radical things that Heschel ever said. I happen to be a scholar of 20th century Judaism, and Heschel is not only my hero, but he's one of the subjects of my work. And I can tell you that he said a whole bunch of radical things, but this is one of the most radical, because what he said, and he never like said things just for the heck of it. His words are always really serious. Jews and Christians need one another to face up to the challenge and the expectation of the living God. He's saying we can't do it by ourselves. That's an amazing statement for a theologian to make. We can't do this by ourselves. Our religious traditions, our own communities, are not self-sufficient. Heschel knew that even in 1965. How much more is it clear in 2016 when we have the added challenge, the task of this generation, I would say, more than any other, of taking care of humanity on this globe and presenting the globe from being made unfit for human habitation, right? We really have the job of being God's partners in stewarding creation in a way that no previous generation did. So here's Heschel saying that we actually need each other. I would start on the surface to probe this, as it were, with the sociology. It's one of the things I do is study the sociology of religion in America to better understand how it is that we should respond to the conditions that face us. One of the things we know as Jews and as Christians that Christianity is losing members in America every day. Judaism is losing members in America every day. The fastest growing religion in America by far, according to the 2016 report of the Pew Research Center, is what Pew calls none, no religion. No religion is growing faster than any religion. You may not know this, but evangelical fundamentalist Christianity was growing really fast until the early 1990s, and then it leveled off. And since the 1990s, what's growing is none. Protestantism has lost 8% of its members in the last 8 years. America is the most profoundly individualist society on the face of the earth and in human history, for better and for worse. And the dominant fact we should know as religious communities is that Americans do not want to join anything. I congratulate the new members of Riverside Church in defying the contemporary American trend of not being willing to join anything. And we have the experience in Judaism, which I'm sure is not unknown to you, that when we do get new members in our synagogues, they let us know from the word go, don't count on me for much, and I may not be here next year. I'm going to safeguard my options. I'm a sovereign self. Don't tell me what I need to do. I believe that what we are offering people, we Jews and we Christians, is a combination of two things that I call face-to-face community and meaning with a capital M. This is a really impersonal society. The statistics on despair in America are shocking. The suicide rate in America is shocking, especially among young people. Americans, above all, feel alone. Many Americans feel hopeless. They want community. They need community. They're wary of it, lest they lose control of their options. But when we provide people with face-to-face community, they come back for more because it's a precious experience. And that's particularly true if you combine this with what I call meaning with a capital M. So we all have our smartphones in our pockets, and you know the minute that you turn them on, someone's trying to sell you something. People are trying to sell you something at every minute. Meaning with a capital M is in short supply. That's why you're here today, I would wager. Because when we see meaning with a capital M, we recognize it and how different it is and how valuable it is. We need stuff to live for and live by. If we have kids, we need guiding values to raise our kids with. We need this meaning with a capital M. You don't find it much in the public life. You need to come to a church or a synagogue or other spiritual institution in America to find it. And this is more true today than it even was in 1965 when Heschel gave that address. So for Heschel, the question was, how can a Jew, out of his commitment, and a Christian, out of his commitment, and if Heschel were writing now, believe me, it would be his or her. It wouldn't be his. How can a Jew and Christian, out of their commitments, find a religious basis for communication and cooperation on matters relevant to their moral and spiritual concern in spite of disagreement? Heschel wanted us to cooperate for concrete reasons because it's in our mutual interest. But he believed that we need to go deeper than that. We need to get as deep as we can and cooperate with each other because it's a religious imperative to cooperate. And Heschel said one more thing, which I want to read to you, and this will be my final message to you this morning. This is Heschel's notion of where the basis for that religious cooperation is. First of all, he said, we come together on the level of fear and trembling. At the deepest level, where we encounter God, that level of fear and trembling in front of others, in front of the world, in front of ourselves, we're afraid. And we need to reach out to each other in that fear. But he goes on to say, at that level, once we're ready for it, once we're open to it, I'm going to read now, individual moments of faith are mere waves in the endless ocean of mankind's reaching out to God, where all formulations and articulations appear as understatements, where our souls are swept away by the awareness of the urgency of answering God's call. I love that passage, and that's why I wanted to share it with you today. The formulations, on the one hand, they give us meaning in life. This is the meaning with a capital M. On the other hand, we know they are understatements. They don't capture God. You can't hold God in your hand and say, I know this and that's God, I've got it right here. No, they're understatements. They're grasping at something beyond you. We know we have rituals and they're precious to us. And I don't want to give them up. We're not talking about swallowing up our distinctness in some great lowest common denominator faith. But simultaneously with that preciousness of our rituals and our words and our formulations, we know that we're part of something larger than ourselves as individuals and larger than ourselves as communities. And all of our individual traditions are swept along, as it were, swept away by the awareness of the urgency of answering God's call. First thing that God says to Adam and Eve, right? Where are you? First thing that God says to us, how are you going to be holy? How are you going to be holy? What are you going to do today to be holy? And what Heschel is saying, which I'm honored to repeat, is that doing things like we're doing here, like I was in synagogue yesterday morning and you're in church this morning, that's the beginning of the answer to the call, because that reminds you of the call. That opens yourself to that call, reminds you where you are to be. But what happens the rest of the week is the answer to the call that counts. Let's all try to do holiness together. Thank you.